to Social Evolution, a show about the future of humanity, technology, culture, governance, and more. I'm one of your hosts, Michael Porcelli.
And I'm Max Borders.
And today we're going to be talking about governance. It's kind of a hot topic these days. Yesterday was January 6, 2022, and this is like a year since the Capitol riot. So topics like elections, the fairness of elections, governance, what democracy is democracy under threat? What do we mean by democracy? Do we like democracy? Do we want democracy? Like, these topics are in recent years actually more on the surface than, just in obscure kind of political science and political philosophy departments in universities. People are actually kind of talking about this. Alternative voting methods are out there. Anyway, we want to give a take that hopefully will expand your mind, maybe expand your palate in terms of what's available in this conversation. And yeah, Max, what comes to mind when we're talking about this kind of topic, this two-party system, this 200-plus-year-old, government constitution that we're living under? Like, what are the issues that you see?
Well, I think the first thing that we need to do together is really talk about the pathologies of the system. And I hate to start off on a negative tone. I so appreciate the wisdom and the intelligence of the American founders. I think the idea of a constitutional republic for its time was just way ahead of the game. They had the wisdom to weave in features of past efforts in governance that they thought would be successful. They understood theoretically the idea of checks and balances and started to see those emerging. And of course, they wanted a participatory system that would not succumb so easily to demagogic forces.
Mm-hmm.
And so what we had was this amazing operating system, call it 1.0, which is the constitutional order in the United States. And the United States happens to be the first of its kind in this regard, where you had this charter of sorts that set out the parameters of what government could and could not do, and what citizens were entitled to, and it distinguished them from subjects. However, the system has since evolved. It's been changed. It has changed by virtue of forces that are baked into the process, and it has changed by forces that are not necessarily baked into the process. And what we have today is a system that is ailing. It is failing in a lot of ways. So I want to, without being disrespectful to the brilliance of the American founding and the very idea of the democratic republic, begin to start to talk about and confront directly what are some of its problems.
Well, this is definitely something that I think is going to find a lot of resonance with listeners, because I don't know, these polling numbers recently of like, well, how many people actually think our country or constitution or democracy is failing? This is actually a weird thing that like people on the left and right actually are agreeing on for different reasons. But like, there definitely is in the air this idea of like, is this even working anymore? And like, let's try to understand why it's not working or how it's not working. And, maybe there's difference in emphasis on the, both ends of the political spectrum about why it's not working. But I think starting off with the pathologies or the ailments or that sort of thing, I think is a really good place to start.
Yeah, I agree. And in fact, I think, people tend to look at symptoms and think of them as pathologies. The root cause analysis, I don't think, is going to land where most people hope it will land. For example, Trump is destroying democracy. Trumpism is destroying democracy. For lack of a better way of putting it, the goddamn liberals are destroying democracy. There is a lot of scapegoating, both in the general sense and in the sense of the French philosopher. Tell me, what's his name?
Which one?
The scapegoat philosopher.
Oh, don't know.
Girard,
yeah.
Yeah. So I think, these pathologies, we have to be very careful about identifying what is symptomatic and what is pathological. And the root cause analysis involved in this is really sticky, really hard. A lot of people are going to want to scapegoat the other side. A lot of people are going to want to say, well, it's social media. Social media is destroying this democratic ideal.
Mm-hmm.
I would call that the Schmachtenberger-Harris thesis.
Sure.
After Daniel Schmachtenberger and Tristan Harris.
Social network documentary.
Yeah. Social dilemma. But I think there's a lot of problems that are baked into the system itself, and that there's problems that give rise to that. There's in the Social Singularity, my book, I opened the book with this idea of getting up one morning and looking at your phone, and there are only two apps,
mm-hmm.
the red app and the blue app,
mm-hmm.
right?
Yep.
And functionally, or at least intuitively, would think that would be a terrible smartphone that only had two apps. And yet that is precisely the kind of operating system that we have right now. There are really very few other choices. And then when we get through into the problematic aspect of special interest capture, of the sort of sociopathy that the system of electoral politics breeds, the horse trading and all that stuff, there's a whole set of layers, bugs in the stack, I guess you could say.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm curious to know what you think is some of the most problematic aspects of this system.
Well, I think I first thought of these bugs probably in my college years, when it was sort of a thing of like, well, people sort of vote in a partisan way because at least it's not the other guy, and voting for a third party candidate, let's say if you were interested in voting for a libertarian or voting for a Green Party candidate, was like a quote unquote wasted vote, because right, like that's basically letting the other guy, so you may as well pick one of the red versus blue that's the closest to you, instead of like what your genuine preference would be, because that's the best we can do in a system where it's this kind of winner take all, kind of like the way the voting is set up. And so that was the first moment where I sort of thought like there's something broken systematically, like you're saying, like, yeah. I'm generally gonna try to see the root cause type of stuff as more kind of faulty systemic stuff, rather than kind of like the scapegoating thing that you're talking about. But that's one thing, and I think a lot of people do that, like, or voting for the least, the lesser evil or something like this, and the fact that that's actually just become a kind of common thought for a lot of people, right? It's like a kind of a cynical view. Like, we do this sort of rah 4th of July thing, or something like whatever it is that we do, that like that American civic religion and the Declaration of Independence, where we're like, we believe in this thing. But then when it actually comes to election season, and when people are like choosing people on the ballots or whatever, they're just kind of like, well, what's the lesser of two evils, right? It's kind of obvious that like all the choices are like crap choices, and once you start to think about like money and politics and the what is it, campaign finance, and Lawrence Lessig wrote a book that I really love too. That was kind of another big awakening, called Republic Lost, that I read. And like, when you can kind of see these ways where you can not necessarily like pay for play directly, like I'll give you this and you'll give me that policy, although corruption like that has existed in American politics, like Tammany Hall in New York City. Like, yeah. You can kind of get at it through sort of hinting, just like, hey, we've got a lot of donors here, and we would love it if blah blah, you were really friendly to just generally this, and okay, I read you, I get, you're sort of telegraphing things, and the fact like you can't even get elected without having this like quantity of funds, a war chest that even gets you into the primary. I'm like, wait a minute, there's something weird here, where it's like the choices themselves that we have on our ballots are already so pre-digested and pre-vetted and pre-selected by powers that we have very little influence.
It's like if you went to a grocery store, right? And somebody and someone from the store brought you two shopping carts already filled with groceries and said, choose one of these.
That's right.
That's it. That we would think that's crazy.
Exactly.
And yet that's exactly what we're doing. And in fact, the grocery cart is not a platform. right? If you want to use the analogy,
Sure.
it's not a platform of principles. Let's say, because left and right have abandoned their principles long ago. It's
Yeah.
not even clear that the that if we could get money out of politics, which is a lot of people think that that's the best idea, is to get money out of politics. But the problem with the idea of getting money out of politics is then you're still going to have massive disagreements on platforms. You're still
Sure.
choosing between two clusters of ideals. So, however you arrive at those shopping carts, whether it's special interest capture or idealists, it's still highly restrictive, not really participatory, and you're still in a lesser of two evils phenomenon, especially in this system where
Yep.
where in a and I'm not even sure. Look, we can talk about other systems like parliamentary systems,
Yeah.
but
Westminster. Yeah.
they're broken for other reasons.
Yep.
So this whole idea of trying to blur preferences for one course of action on behalf of, say, 325 million people should be to people absurd on its face, but it's not. It was absurd to the founders, which is why they tried and failed to bake in states' rights.
Yeah.
But that, I don't want to get us too far ahead of ourselves.
You're bringing in a historical perspective. I was, thinking out loud with a friend the other day, and even these talks of, like, secession or breaking up the country, people are talking about that now too. And
I'm one of them.
yeah. I mean, it's a historical view is kind of interesting. Whatever the 10 or 12,000 years of civilization, depending on how you count it, that we've had, this idea of these very large, like, Westphalian nation states with these border, like here, in elementary school, you have the map on the world, right? And it's like these, little pink and blue and yellow, lines across these territories. You're like, that view that the world is kind of like carved into these, however many there are, states that are at this size that is fairly huge. And then we just say, like, that's the best way to organize. It's like, that's relatively new historically. I mean, we actually have a way more significant portion of the 12,000 years of civilization that was organized around essentially urban centers, urban agricultural centers that were basically somewhat independent of each other. And I'm not saying that, like, this was a romantic view of the past and things were much better back then, but, like, that's a stable configuration that has worked for a huge portion of history.
Well, and it's interesting that you bring that up. I mean, I think this is another problematic aspect. We have this kind of mythology, this nostalgic understanding of civic consciousness, and I think it pervades a lot of our what we were inculcated with as kids, with their civics books and all this kind of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
But it's really just the very idea of the state. You talk about these settled agriculture that creates urban centers, and pretty much the rationale of those areas deep into history was, if you believe at least James C. Scott,
Mm-hmm.
was a protection racket.
Sure.
A big guy comes along and he says, look, I'm going to make you an offer you can't refuse. I'm going to protect you in exchange for a certain percentage of your wheat. And they called that a tax, right? And when people could start to take a little bit of the currency from people later on in Rome, for example, they might not take grain. They might take some of the coinage.
Mm-hmm.
At the end of the day, this is a game theoretical suboptimal situation where these great powers formed by virtue of what is essentially mafioso logic. And that people don't want to acknowledge that. It sounds crazy as hell, but it's actually from the game theoretical construals of those time made a lot of sense. If you're a farmer, you're not a warrior. And if you're a warrior, your contribution is protection, and you want some of that grain. You don't know how to grow it. Boom, Bob's your uncle. You get proto-states, and empires grew from that.
Yeah.
Okay. So now we have a situation where you and I are born into a state of affairs, and someone from Venezuela is born into a state of affairs, and someone in China is born into a state of affairs. By virtue of the fact that they're born on this patch of soil and nothing else means that whatever operating system is configured on that patch of soil, they have to abide by those rules, come what may.
Yeah.
Or leave. And sometimes you can't leave because there's nowhere to go.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, we're drifting into some interesting territory here. Like, we're not just talking about the contemporary, like why it's broken now. We're talking a little bit about the roots of it, and just hold on that for another moment. I mean, unless, I haven't read Scott to the degree that you have, I'm familiar with his ideas, but the roots of it at some level, I think of it like, hey, if we're going to play a game together, we want a referee that's a neutral third party. And I can see in a way the emergence of the proto state that's a little bit less of a mafioso logic and more of like, you know, do I want to be the enforcer of the fairness of our market exchanges? Do you want to be the enforcer? Here I'm talking about kind of like a primitive libertarianism, so to speak. It seems sort of natural that like a group of people will be like, hey, let's just pick some subset of ourselves to be the neutral parties when there are disputes, right? Like,
right. And this is generally the Madisonian view.
yeah.
And this is and to some extent the Hobbesian view. I think it's like muted Hobbesianism. It's like,
Yeah.
okay, if I'm going to be the biggest, baddest mother in the place,
yeah,
let me be wise and let me be fair-minded and let me adjudicate between these different conceptions of the good and try to keep the peace.
Mm-hmm.
That is the general Hobbesian rationale, and it's one that we tend to accept. Fundamentally, most people accept to this day. They don't see how it could be otherwise. I think the purpose of this show today is to demonstrate that not only could it be otherwise, but probably should.
Let's get into it. Yeah.
All right.
Cool. So, or do we want to talk more about the pathologies right now, or do you want to move into kind of some thoughts on like what are alternatives? What do you think?
Well, let's talk about a couple more problematic aspects of this, right?
Yeah, I'm ready.
First of all, there's this idea of the one true way,
Mm-hmm.
right? That whoever wins in this titanic tug of war, right, which is essentially what it is.
Mm-hmm.
You've got a tug of war, red team and blue team, and special interests on both sides are helping pull, right?
Mm-hmm.
And every election cycle, one of those teams wins, and they get to instantiate the rules based mostly on what the special interests want because they've provided the war chest, to mix metaphors. But in any case, the people who are laboring on one side of the rope or the other fancy that they have access to the one true way.
Mm-hmm.
Even if they could get rid of the special interest to whom they have to sell their souls to do this stuff,
yeah,
they think that they have the one true way. This is the philosopher king mentality, right?
Yeah.
Well, there's a lot of true ways out there as we're starting to see, and nobody and everybody wants to claim access to the one true way, and that should be instantiated at the level of the central government, shoved down everybody else's throat.
Yeah.
Well, this is what creates a lot of the tribalism we have, right? This is what creates the tension, is that everybody's got access to one true way. Their values are supreme values. The other person's values suck. They suck. They're evil. They're good and bad. We turn Manichaean. But this comes from the very institutional substrate that we're calling into question today, not from the fact that everybody has one true way kind of thinking. Because if you change the institutional rules underneath this stuff, then people will start to be, I believe, a lot more circumspect and a lot more reflective about their one true way opinions. That's the first thing. Second thing, voting. You're crying your teardrop in the ocean and expecting the tide to turn. I mean, come on. The probability of your vote affecting the outcome of the election is close to nil unless you live in a swing state. And even then, that shows you just how arbitrary this is, that someone in Ohio or Virginia is going to determine the outcome of this whole thing for 325 million people in the United States, for example. That's crazy.
Mm-hmm.
Anything else for you that's problematic? I could go on all day about this.
So, I want to go back to the one true way idea a little bit and poke at it, because I think it's, if I were listening to what you just said, I would be like, hey, but one of the things that the modern political philosophers, these guys, we talked about Locke and Hobbes and Madison and these guys, like it's like trying to solve for perhaps an error of the Greeks, right? The Greeks sort of saw democracy as almost like a mob rule, or almost like a stage and a cycle of a thing. And this kind of idea that democracy back then maybe meant just strictly majoritarian rule. And then the modernist political philosophers are like, let's add this concept of liberalism, right? Like, which is a kind of a restraint, or this idea of checks and balances. And when you're talking about like, hey, like, what about trying to impose this one true way? I thought, and I think it's accurate to say at least it was an idea to solve for the one true way problem, which is like,
Definitely.
look, we're going to say over here, you can have religious freedom and you can run your household how you want. You can run your communities how you want, right? We don't have to agree between, this this belief system and that belief system. But what we can agree on is this kind of restrained type of governance that allows essentially the fact of pluralism. We've talked about this before. Like,
Yes.
we're not going to get onto the same page about like, we're going to run the country according to like a puritanical code, or or a Sharia law or whatever. We're not going to get there ever. So let's just allow those to be neighborly, in a sense, by having a smaller set, this, whatever we want to call it, the Bill of Rights, or this kind of more, I suppose, minimalistic universalism that we can all agree on, that allows, it is like a platform to allow for this pluralism.
Well, so I agree with that. I think if we were able to instantiate the liberal vision of the founders,
yes,
truly, where the Ninth and 10th Amendments to the Constitution, for example, meant something, where they do not mean anything now. They literally mean nothing. When is the last time you've heard of a case being brought towards to the Supreme Court that had to do with the Ninth or 10th Amendment? They're essentially inert, but they were supposed to guarantee states' rights, that everything that the federal government does should be spelled out really clearly in the Constitution and otherwise proscribed by the Bill of Rights, specifically 9 and 10. That's dead. That is essentially dead. I mean, if it weren't for people like George Mason, who is one of the American founders, who doesn't get a lot of sunlight these days.
Yep.
If you combine the George Mason rationale with the Madisonian rationale of trying to prevent faction with all these people who have whether it's the one true way or the Tammany Hall Devils, there's the one true way angels,
right?
And then there's the Tammany Hall Devils, and for all intents and purposes, they might as well be the same person. They're called human beings with just different opinions.
Yeah.
This factionalization is going to happen. The question is, how do you deal with it? And how do you prevent it from corrupting the republic? That's the questions they were confronted with. And interestingly, Jefferson had two very quickly, two ideas I think were super important. The first was this, this idea that he wrote into the Declaration of Independence, which is the consent of the governed.
Yes.
The way we interpret the consent of the governed these days is that you show up and send your prayers up in the voting booth. Okay. Yeah. Teardrop in the ocean again. Choose your metaphor. It doesn't work. That's not consent. Let's not kid each other. And there's also no such thing as a social contract. There's just not. Okay. If you like that kind of talk, great. But there's, hypothetical social contracts are silly. Now, the second thing that Jefferson brought to the table, I thought, was after he had retired from presidential life, he wrote to one of his friends about ward republics. He was basically saying, we were not able to install these liberal angels. And already after my presidency, I'm seeing the dissolution of the republic. We need to have far more localization. And I agree with Jefferson in that regard.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think it's interesting to think about the moment in which it was kind of created. And, there weren't nations of the scope, like 300 million people, from sea to shining sea, like that happened later, right? Like the westward expansion of the United States of America comes way after the Constitution. And, I think there is I don't think age is necessarily an ailment, but this idea of, I'm a futurist, right? And just like you are, and like I like innovation and I like disruption. I mean, I have a conservative aspect of me too, which is sort of like, don't throw the baby out with the bathwater, and these ideas like Chesterton's fence, you should understand a thing before you get rid of it.
Right.
But on the other hand, like I do think this idea that we encoded this thing called the United States Constitution as long ago as we did, we still it would be like we're running on MS DOS or something on supercomputers. You know what I mean? It's like, why do we think that this version of the liberal ideal? So what we're saying here, at least what I'm hoping, is like the liberal ideal of the restrained thing, is kind of what we're thumbs up on it. We're just basically saying the system as it is failing, or has failed, and has failed possibly for a very long time now at delivering on that. And instead, what we have is this kind of almost like Lord of the Rings, like one ring of power thing, where we just keep adding more powers to the executive branch, and it keeps getting larger rather than smaller. And instead of like preserving the thing that the liberal democracy was supposed to be preserving, which was the restraint, we've actually created something that's ever more expansionary, like ever more percent of the spending in the economy right. It's like this is
it's a monstrous beast,
right?
And it's also a monstrous hybrid, to use Jane Jacobs' term, because it has features of corporations and has features of the state, which makes it even more monstrous, right? So the special interest capture, mingled with the idealism, creates these bootleggers and Baptist phenomena, things like that. But I want to go back to something you said, and I think this is a really important point. The first thing we want to do is really parse the distinction between traditional conservatism and traditional progressivism. And I'm using progressive instead of liberal for a reason.
Yes.
Because the liberals that we are referring to were about something very different than either conservatives or progressives. But let's give the conservatives and the progressives, traditionally speaking, their due.
Awesome.
You said something great, and that was Chesterton's fence.
Mm-hmm.
The idea, like, before we tear this fence down, let's find out why it was built and how it functions.
Right. What does it
do?
And
if we don't know that, it might be something in amber for no reason at all, except some sort of like intergenerational groupthink, or it might be there for a reason. We just don't fully understand the reason, because society is so complex. That's why conservatives tend to be interested in the power of tradition.
Yes.
Because tradition can be a conduit of wisdom, even if that wisdom isn't terribly well understood.
Sure.
So there's your conservatives, giving them their due. Traditional conservatives, not modern conservatives.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah.
At least not most of them.
The depoliticized version of that word
is the depoliticized version of the word conservative. Exactly.
Yeah.
The depoliticized version of progressive is, okay, we want to make change for the better. We want to be able to make change for the better.
Yes.
We might not be so concerned about the means of how that change is made, and ought to be, if the conservative standing there going, wait. But otherwise, we are concerned about ends that are important, are valuable, and are good. And in service of those good ends, we want to do stuff. Get out of the way, right? We want to make change for the good of all. There's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with that in isolation, just as there's nothing wrong with the conservative who's standing right next to him or her saying, but wait a minute. Yeah. In order to do that, you might have to tear down something important, right?
Right.
So here we have two different perspectives from which have degenerated into views that don't take either of those perspectives into account very much. And what we get now is more like tribal warfare, a series of talking points and opinions that cluster together in in-groups that don't really have any kind of attachment to principles at all.
Yeah. Well, this is great. Like this idea that the whatever the red blue two-party system is has become unmoored even entirely from this traditional conservative, liberal, or progressive thing you're talking about. I mean, that was another light bulb for me back at this similar, age, my, early 20s. I was like, wait, so, if you sort of think of the I don't know if you remember this, like, we have nowadays we have that kind of political compass where it's like, let's break this down instead of like a left to right spectrum, like a two-dimensional one. And the favored one these days is like where it's like authoritarian versus libertarian and like left versus right. And this is kind of like find your place on the
It's like a
map.
Nolan chart kind of thing.
Yeah, yeah. And I'm like, oh, that's pretty cool. Like these people are kind of thinking in an additional dimension. But the two dimensions that were more popular, I suppose, when people were reflecting on this in my early 20s was are you like is it social versus economic, right? So like in the Republicans were sort of like economically liberal, I suppose, and like socially conservative, right? And the progressives were sort of economically whatever
conservative,
right? And socially liberal, and like that was another kind of two-dimensional matrix of kind of making sense of where you were at. And like when I saw that, I was like, oh, that's sort of weird. It was a little bit of my early appeal of libertarianism for me. I'm like, oh, at least the libertarian view is consistent, right? Like economically liberal and socially liberal. Like, and I'm like, ooh, I like the feel of that, right? There's some internal consistency there. And I'm not necessarily arguing for any one of these particular places, but just for the listener, I imagine at some point or another in your life, if you're listening to a podcast like us, you've thought about this way, that like these two shopping carts of like just aggregated things, pre-digested packages of stuff. It's like, it seems somewhat arbitrary. And this is kind of, this is one of the things, this part of the ailment or the pathology of the current system is you're like, this shopping cart was assembled by a bunch of people that you don't know and you weren't there, and they made a whole bunch of deals with each other of like, you support me on this and I'll support you on that, which is essentially like horse trading and money. And then they present these two pre-digested packages, and then you have this weird kind of correlation where like, well, I guess if I'm against abortion, then I'm in favor of free market economics. And you're like, right? It's like, well, why? Right? Like, I mean, it's just because somebody grouped them together before you got there.
That's right.
Right. And now you're sort of faced with the false choice that is like so constrained, where you're sort of like, well, I either have to pick package A or package B, or waste my vote on some third party, whatever,
and that's what's so beautiful about independent media these days. You get these category killers like Glenn Greenwald and Joe Rogan, and even the lower brow stuff, like a lot of people make fun of Rogan because he's the biggest podcaster in the world, so whatever, but he's got interesting guests on his show, and they're not nearly all the same. What's common about them is, in matter of fact, just how different they are from one guest to the next. But that one guest to the next heterodox thinking that it engenders, I think, is healthy, because it really points to the fact of pluralism. And it exposes the ridiculous duality of the American system. And I think people are hungry for something else now. It's building. You'll find that sometimes these filter bubbles and these, the way the algorithms constantly serve up people will there will be loci, locus points, loci, whatever, around. You'll get these sort of like strange attractors around certain figures or whatever, and it's still basically left and right. But there's a lot of heterodox voices out there, and they're growing. And the reason that it's good to have heterodoxy growing is because it's going to get to a point where we look at the system with the two shopping carts held out before us and go, why this? Or or waking up with your phone and seeing the red app and the blue app and wondering, where the hell is my iPad with the 4,000 apps on it?
Right. Where'd that go?
Totally. Where's that? But I don't want to skip too far ahead. I think a lot of this, I think a lot of this idea of deliberation and of trying to track truth in order to be a good citizen is itself problematic. I do have a sort of a little bit of historical respect for that view. You know, the idea of like the ideal person for the for politics. This is both Aristotelian and
like a
Platonic.
well-informed,
The well-informed voter, this and that. I mean, we've done a lot of research to understand that there's just no such thing as the well-informed voter. Not really. Like most people I talk to about mohair subsidies don't even know what mohair is. You know, so it's like, well, and that's, you know, political economists call this rational ignorance, rational irrationality. In other words, the cost of gaining the requisite knowledge to make informed decisions beyond the shopping carts is too high and too costly.
Yeah.
Why the hell do we have this system? Oh, well, it's path dependency. We always have, we always should. At school, they told us that we were the greatest country in the world, and the fact that we were a democratic republic, and this sort of nostalgic bullshit keeps us, excuse my mouth, keeps us locked into this mind frame. And that doesn't mean I don't respect the hell out of the founders. I do.
Yeah.
But the way this system has evolved away from the founding project, it's silly. Scrap it. But Chesterton's fence, we got to scrap it carefully, and we got to know what we're scrapping.
Yeah. So I love that we're kind of starting to ease into kind of some of the underlying things of like you said, like what we do need to preserve, and even this idea of like, do we need this well-informed voter, coherent thing? And I think you and I may actually find some interesting points of contention between the two of us, which I think will make for an interesting discussion. But I do, before we just depart here, I want to just acknowledge something that we have sort of acknowledged in implicit ways in our conversation, but to really, especially in the moment that we're in, the polarization thing has become so extreme, and it becomes its own feedback loop. And like you and I like to focus on, hey, these growing voices in this heterodox domain and on YouTube or in podcasting world, and like the diversity and pluralism that's out there. And I'm like, agreed. That's really cool. And I think more and more people are tuning in, more and more people are defecting on, you know, the Fox News and the MSNBC. However, that's not everybody. The other thing that's happening is the voices at these extremes are becoming shrill. And if we're looking at, you know, perhaps there was some ideal version of like a post-war United States, or people talk about like, you know, liberal Republicans and conservative Democrats, and like the ability to compromise or to reach across the aisle. And to some degree, it seems like they were a little bit better during that phase about doing that than we are now. But like now, especially since the January 6th thing happened in 2011, 2021, I mean, it's like, oh, the other side is just pure bad. Like even trying to cooperate with them or deliberate with them or discuss with them is bad. And like, and right now it's like, oh, well, like, yeah, the Democrats are trying to annihilate democracy, and they've installed unfairly, you know, Joe Biden, or the reverse, which is sort of like, you know,
right.
Trump tried a hostile takeover, a coup, or
with the help of the Russians. Right.
And like, whatever this is, like the narrative has become so polarized that each side is now basically saying like, well, they're the enemy like of the whole system, and I'm the protector of the system, and we can't even listen to them anymore.
We want a better, pure democracy that's for the people. Right. And those guys are trying to tear it down. And it's just ridiculous. It's like, there's no pure, better democracy. There's just not.
Yes.
Okay. I mean, you could get marginally better along certain dimensions, but there's just something fundamentally foobar about, you know, 50% plus one. It's, you know, there's just a goofiness to it.
I agree. If you equate democracy with 50% plus one, which is maybe a little bit of a contentious point right there, but sure.
Well, I mean, look, and then you start to look at the machine, the apparatus that is, you know, governance in the United States, governance models in the United States.
Yeah.
it's equally absurd, but for different reasons. It's sort of like our shrillness is because we want to commandeer this machine in service of our conception of the good, and this machine is flopping around and it's slamming people. It's, it just doesn't work. The
Yeah.
special interests are over here tugging on one of the arms of this apparatus, and it's like, but they're so shrill because they want to be the ones to drive it, even
Yes.
though it's an undrivable machine.
Yeah.
And the whole idea of, an economy or a society as a machine that needs to be built, fixed, or run is kind of in people's minds when they have this one true way mentality, this tribal groupthink mentality. So we got to disabuse ourselves of that. But the only way to do that is, I believe, to make people have more skin in the game. And that is to say, your shrillness should come from trying to attract people to your niche, governance niche. And this is a new concept I'm doling out here, except for states' rights.
Yeah.
States' rights was a way of introducing multiple governance niches.
Yeah.
That was still wedded to the old idea of terra firma and jurisdiction on terra firma, which is, an artifact of conquest and law that emerges on conquest of certain soil by somebody. That's just how it has been historically. The question is, does it need to be that way anymore? And the other question is, can we create new niches? And if we can those niches survive and persist in time? Are they sustainable of their own volition by virtue of membership in your group? If you can bring more and more members into your group who are successfully finding the governance systems working in service of their conception, their common conception of the good, there you go. Yep. Now you're approaching something that is more like the ideal of democracy, shorn of its problematic aspects.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. And this is the whatever, if there's a market niche that you and I want to speak to, it's the people that are like, hey, we get it. Like it's that horseshoe theory of like the shrill far lefties and the shrill far right people start sounding the same, really more than different, actually.
Talk about that for a minute. Because you and I have talked about this, but our audience is going to be curious. What do you mean by horseshoe? How could they possibly have anything in common?
Right. Like this idea that, if you go far out enough on the extreme, that like maybe in content, their differences become amplified, but there's something about the tone or the form or some of the things they start saying start sounding the same. And it's this idea that like, instead of going out along a line, you're kind of like, they're starting to bend around and actually become more similar than different. And the similarity is actually more kind of like, we're in an emergency and you need to trust us to like, handle everything because we're under threat and those other guys are going to like destroy everything. Right. Yeah. Like, and that's the thing you start hearing that sounds the same. Right. Like, and the solutions are often very much the same, which is sort of like, you got to give us emergency powers. Right. Like, like hand it over right now because they're about to like destroy everything. Like, and it's like, okay, like whatever these far extreme versions are is just, they sound more and more like the one true way. And we're in a state of emergency. And
I'll give you two good examples. Those are negative examples. I'll give you two good examples. The first one is 9/11, right? And I got swept up into this. I'll admit it. I was like, I was swept up into get them, after 9/11. It was from my emotions, I believe in hindsight, clouded my ability to reason through it. Mm-hmm. And of course, we learned a lot over time about the problem of war as a means of, look, there are other, there are good perspectives on both sides, but essentially what we got from that, from 9/11 is a surveillance state that I don't think anybody really wants or likes anymore. The Patriot Act, doubling down on the Patriot Act, blowing up expanding whole agencies and their powers, reducing the powers of other, of the citizen and so on. after a while, I think both left and right were like, this is not necessarily a good thing. Although I'm glad that there are people there prosecuting the global war on terror and protecting us. Having to give up our civil liberties and entirely, in great measure, was deeply problematic. And here now we have the same thing happening with respect to January 6th. Yesterday was the 1-year anniversary of January 6th, and we get words like insurrection.
Mm-hmm.
And the word insurrection is really, designed to justify the instantiation of an expanded deep state, the suspension or dismantling of civil liberties in law, and the ability to sort of track people with whom you don't agree. Saying, oh, it's insurrection or domestic terrorism,
Mm-hmm.
when I've seen worse things happen at rock concerts than what happened there. A real insurrection is what happened, to Ceausescu in 1989.
Right.
This wasn't an insurrection. This was a bunch of rednecks who rioted and breached. And I don't want to like disparage people, but in essence, what you got was a riotous group that burned out of control, breached the Capitol, and went in there, raised hell, and a bunch of them got arrested.
Mm-hmm.
You'll notice that there is nothing resembling in the charges brought against these 700 or so people, nothing resembling insurrection, sedition, any of these kinds of laws. And there's a reason for that, because it wasn't. They weren't really armed. Anyway, we can go on about that. That's a political hot button. And the point is not to take sides in that.
Yeah.
Right. The point is to say both parties want to figure out how to grow their own power and largesse that goes to that power. And they both were successful of it by scaring the shit out of people.
Yep. And that's where the horseshoe thing kind of happens. And, let's leave that for now and say, look, what we're trying to talk about is something that, as best as we can, doesn't fall prey to one of these similar types of dynamics of extremism. And, it's with some degree of trepidation and humility I step into that, because like cognitive bias, and you're not free of it and I'm not free of it, and like powers that are beyond our ability to understand or control, like, are influencing you and me, just as they are influencing these shrill voices on the extreme right and the extreme left. But I do think we have some really clever and interesting ideas worth considering that, we didn't originate these ideas, about, like, well, what would be a way of coming together that's maybe beyond left and right, and beyond liberal and conservative, or progressive
Right.
conservative, or this two-party system, or this winner-take-all style of voting. It's like, and I think, one of the things that was happening, I can't remember when it was not that long ago. It was like some jurisdictions decided on, like, hey, let's do approval voting instead of first past the post voting, winner take all, or let's do ranked choice voting. And I think there are in the United States, like, there's and I know there's limitations even with these particular kind of voting systems that are alternative to the winner take all, but in some way it kind of makes voting for the person you really prefer, or voting for that third party candidate, less of a wasted vote if you could do ranked choice or approval voting. And
right,
I'm not trying to advocate specifically for one or the other of these, but to simply say we're in a moment that's actually ripe for discussing the underlying architecture of our systems.
yes,
And people are open to, like, well, what if we did it this way instead of that way, or tried something different? And I think this talk of governance it's in the air, and it's really interesting, and one of our favorite topics of blockchains and decentralized tech, there's talk of governance over there. Like, how do we govern how we do code changes on our blockchain crypto system? And, like, crypto governance, even though it's not trying to be societal governance just yet, at least decision makers of, like, how the miners all come to make decisions about what code to install for their blockchains is a matter of governance. And so, like,
Yeah.
Governance. People are fucking talking about it, like corporate governance and, alternative forms of that. We've talked about that before as well, like holacracy and these kinds of things.
Right.
It's kind of cool that like it's a moment where people are like some people, and that's you, our listener. Like, hopefully you're interested enough to be part of this conversation of like, what are the systemic level things we can do to change things or make them better? That is
Right. So
beyond partisan politics.
one thing is, and there's marginal changes and there's fundamental changes.
Yeah.
And I do agree that there's some really cool voting systems out there that are emerging. Proxy voting, also known as liquid democracy, is kind of interesting.
Yep.
There's ranked choice voting. There's Janacek method out of the Czech Republic. There's a brilliant mathematician, I think, named Janacek, who allows you to express not only who you like but who you hate. Right.
Yeah.
So you have like a black ball.
Weil has that quadratic voting thing.
Quadratic voting, yeah. Weil and Buterin. These are interesting models when your consensus mechanism requires sometimes you have a collective action problem.
Yeah.
Okay. And I want to acknowledge this and take a step back and say, what is it? Okay, what is this collective action problem? A collective action problem is simply something that is a decision that seems, at least, to need to be made on behalf of an entire group, a single decision, right?
Yeah.
And the game theoretical dynamics of that can be difficult in terms, especially when our default is usually majoritarian rule. Some of the early DAOs, for example, for the technological specs of, say, inside of Dash cryptocurrency, were done with majoritarian rule, and that's okay, right? But what they're learning is that there might be better ways to do it that include more preferences and include more negative preferences. There's, where you approach unanimity a lot more because there has to be a single vote made. I love, and here's a shout out to Marginal Revolution's Alex Tabarrok. His is not a voting system, but I think it is an adjudication mechanism that's really interesting called dominant assurance contracts. Dominant assurance contracts are a form of assurance contract that where the person who makes the proposal has more skin in the game. We should have Alex on the show to talk about dominant assurance contracts sometime. But there again, that is how you provide a public good through private means, which is much, much different from let's elect some people who decide 2 years into our having elected them that they're going to build some massive public works project, and they do it by dint of horse trading and voting on some council. So it's majoritarian at the level of the council, and everybody else is like, what? So now we're building a stadium for a rich guy, a basketball stadium for a rich guy. We're going to pay for that. I don't watch basketball. What the hell's going on? Whereas with a dominant assurance contract model, you might be able to provide something like that, have it be owned collectively, have people benefit from having tokenized that and brought it into existence. And if you think it can be profitable, then you get some return on. I mean, there's all kinds of really cool stuff out there that's made possible by the cryptocurrency space. And I don't want to keep us too far going down that rabbit hole. Suffice it to say, there's things that we can do at the margins to solve collective action problems.
Yeah.
And sometimes we don't need to solve a collective action problem. We just need to go in two different directions and create two different systems.
Yes. So there's so much in here. Like, what I think is interesting before we move on further into solutions, there's a way that I think of this collective action problem thing that it just comes. It's, I guess, an evolutionary perspective, right? Like, humans are social animals, and ultimately, for us to fulfill our basic needs, but also to flourish, we need each other. We have to have each other, right? And like, we are in the spectrum of sociality amongst other animals. We are hypersocial, probably more social than any other creatures except termites and ants and bees. And that means that we do have something like collective action type of agreements we get into with each other all of the time. Like we pool our resources, or like we pool our money together in insurance policies, and or we create nation states where we pool our money together
We make
versus
mutuals.
taxation.
Mutuals are really, really good. Whether it's a mutual aid society or a mutual insurance arrangement, these
Yeah.
are really interesting time tested structures
Yeah.
that we can do that move a lot of earth.
Yeah. Honestly, corporations are a kind of private collective, if you really think about what they are. And that, I am all for cooperation and groups coming together to do things for mutual benefit, because we are so much more together. There are this non-zero sum idea that like what we're able to do together exceeds what we could all do sort of summed up as individual, like separate people. Like that's, I think, basically true. And it's a fundamental tenet of markets and corporations and governments and mutuals and all these things.
I'm going to say something that might upset people, including you. But I would say the degree to, so what's interesting about what you just said there about organizations, different organizations, particularly corporations, is they almost always have missions. Okay. Now, some don't because they have mission creep or adrift and for whatever reason. But organizations, generally speaking, have missions. They have raison d'être, right? And if they don't have a mission, they usually dissolve or have to adopt one quickly to maintain their coherence. The difference between a fascist and a liberal is someone who thinks that society or the economy does or does not have a mission. Okay? Mussolini thought societies have missions. And the purpose of the state was to conscript the corporations into its broader corpus to realize those missions. Interestingly, when you start talking to people about the common good and the public good, they start sounding a whole hell of a lot like Mussolini and don't even realize it. But from a functional standpoint, there's not much difference there. And if there is, somebody, you or somebody else, is going to have to explain what that difference is. Now, if you phrase it in terms of a liberal kind of mission, which is the purpose of the state is to protect the rights and freedoms of citizens, okay, but you're still preserving, the point is to preserve their autonomy. That is another way of saying there is no mission per se that requires XYZ functionally to achieve it, except however your monolithic conception of protecting rights and freedoms is. And we could get into that in another episode. But suffice it to say, generally speaking, the Hayekian view is that societies and economies don't have missions. They're non-teleological, which is what distinguishes them from organizations.
Yeah. So there may be, I mean, I largely agree with you. And, this idea of either a communist ideal or a fascist ideal that like all organizations should be subservient to as though it's a collective ideal is problematic. And it ends up justifying the worst human rights violations that we see historically, but on the other hand, if we're talking about something like a liberal conception, classically liberal conception, libertarian conception of markets, like this idea that there is some monarchical kind of referee style of like maintaining the basic rules under which kind of the reality of pluralism and diversity can flourish. Is that a mission? I think to some degree it is a mission. And to kind of go back to the collective action issue, it's like, once we pool, like if you and I pool together and say, hey, we're going to do this thing, well, then we have to kind of abide by the rules that we mutually agree to, which is, not a fictitious social contract, but a real social contract where the terms are, either written on a legal document or they're encoded in a smart contract. But at a certain point, it's kind of like, hey, oh yeah, this sounds really good. Let's all pool together and whatever. And then I'm kind of like, hey, I want to make a claim on this pool that we've created. Let's say it's just one of these kind of collective insurance contracts of some kind,
sure,
social safety net or whatever. You're kind of like, hey, like I need help, so I paid into this thing. I need to kind of get something out of this thing, well, then I got to abide essentially by whatever the governance of this collective pool is. And if I don't like it, I could leave. But, if suddenly, everyone could just fork as individual contributors for whatever reason they want it at any given moment they want, like you kind of create another game theoretical dynamic that sort of prevents the pool from even kind of forming, right? So you got to, this is why, stock purchase lock-in periods exist, right? It's like you go in and it's like, yeah, you're in now. You can't just fucking get out of it, right? Or, if you pop in and out of like debt all the time, your credit rating goes down or something like this. Like there's some way of at least, the open source movement in software is actually a fun technological example of this. Fun is kind of a weird word to say. He forked all the time, and everyone was like, how come we can't get any traction against Microsoft Windows? And that's because that's because you have like 100 versions of Linux. It's because I don't like you, and so we're just going to fork and make a new one. And it's like, well, then you're kind of undermining the ability to create like
network effects
cool together. Yeah, a network effect.
Yeah. I mean, I think those kind of those kind of thing. I think first I want to just say I think that we dodged a merely semantic disagreement there.
Okay.
Because cool. I totally agree with you. We need these structures and we need them to hang together, right?
Yeah.
We need both things. We need actual social contracts, not hypothetical social contracts, not whatever the hell that I come up with in my mind is my conception of the good gets to be the common good. Yeah. It's really that whatever system that we have, we agree to what is the common good, and we abide by the processes of both change and exit through honoring both sides of that agreement.
Yeah.
So there is the pool, the common rule set that gets established for the group.
Yeah.
Everybody has to abide by that. All parties have to agree to that. Okay.
Yeah.
So the collective in a DAO has to uphold their part of the agreement and the rules of the game.
Yeah.
And the participants in that have to abide by their side of the agreement and uphold the rules of the game. Otherwise, there will never be any coherence in the system. However, and this is a good time, I think, to get into because we only have about 5 minutes.
Yeah.
But I think it's worth talking about polycentricity and polyarchy. Okay, very briefly as a punchline.
Yes.
We
go into it in way more depth in a future episode. Like maybe
and we absolutely should. If by the way, if listeners, if you like what you're hearing here and you want more of it, let us know. We'll let us know through whatever means, email, social media. We're interested in it. Mm-hmm. But this goes back to the sort of raw Jeffersonian conception, which is tied to terra firma in a lot of ways because he didn't have technological means.
Yeah,
mass communications, any of it. So his notion of jurisdiction is tied to terra firma, right? But he still had a really, really robust notion of polycentricity, which is the idea of breaking up centers of power. Mm-hmm. Absolute power corrupts absolutely, as we're seeing right now in the United States. We need to be able to break that up. We will start to see the rise of the states, of local jurisdictions, and that is a good thing. Even if you don't agree with any particular jurisdiction is doing, it's creating a situation that Taleb would call anti-fragile. That is to say, decisions made on behalf of the entire group can be catastrophic for the entire group if it's done in error. A decision made on behalf of a subset of that group won't be catastrophic for the whole.
Right.
It'll be catastrophic locally, and the adaptation can occur locally.
Yep.
Especially if people are in their locality, can make observations, and there are good feedback loops in that locality.
Yes.
The idea of federalism and subsidiarity is in desperate need of a resurgence, because otherwise you cannot handle the complexity of this world without it.
We have some version of it to a degree, in the sense that we see people there's a lot of exodus out of California. Elon Musk has talked about his choice to leave California, and Joe Rogan did too. And there are differences between Texas and California, for example, just to pick one pair example. Like, and there's so much more that could be realized under this ideal. Like it, and it's funny because a lot of times national politics is like show business, and we all are all super hand wringing and concerned over these big Mitch McConnell and Donald Trump and Joe Biden and whatever. And instead of like, it's like, who's on your city council? I don't know.
Yes.
It would be way better if our, areas of concern were actually more kind of correlated or corresponding to our areas of influence. And like right now, these things are really skewed by this bizarro, like hyper centralized system that we've created. And I think this idea of like more of a restoration of like locality of influence and concern kind of being more correlated together, that is actually not just creates more systemic resiliency. I think it actually creates more freaking sanity for everyday citizens of kind of like, oh, I can make a difference.
Yeah, it's the availability. It's like we have chosen and institutionalized the availability cascade.
Yeah.
Availability heuristic from availability cascade is Timur Kuran and Cass Sunstein, but they get it from Amos Tversky or whatever. Anyway, the idea is the media builds up one very hyper localized or very rare phenomenon, and election cycles turn out to be that, right? So all of the oxygen gets sucked up by the national spectacle when all the real action that affects you is local.
Right.
And so we ignore it. 8% of the population, if you're lucky, turns out for these local elections.
Yep.
Whereas if we had more decentralized power, where all our local authorities were making really titanic decisions locally on our behalves, we'd all be turning out to those town halls, those public meetings, making sure we're voting. And I'm not even suggesting that that's the way that the consensus mechanism should happen locally. I am, I believe in actually even more subsidiarity than at the city level, and more niches. But before we go, there's this interesting idea I want to leave you with called polyarchy or panarchy. Yeah. And we may have to leave this for another episode, but I keep talking about this idea of jurisdictions affixed to territory.
Yes.
And this is one where you can adopt a governance system that may or may not be affixed to territory, where we have governance in the cloud. Okay. I'll leave it for the moment right there. DAOs represent a good instantiation of that, which is a blockchain-based system of participatory creation of mutuals and civil societies, civic societies. And polyarchy is a very promising avenue for change in the age of complexity.
Yep. I agree with that. And I think that's something we can get into at more depth, but like the principle makes sense. Rather than sort of locality of geography, you're talking about maybe something that's more abstract, but it's kind of like an area of concern, and people kind of joining across geographical regions around certain areas of concern and deciding to govern those areas together.
Absolutely.
And I think some combination of this kind of disaggregation to geographical locality plus, in a way, a kind of a reaggregation of areas of concern will give us something. And we'll just leave this as a teaser for the future of governance. Max, this has been super fun.
I want to do more. I wish we had more time.
And
let's bring them back for next time.
Part 2 for this conversation. All right. Awesome.
Excellent.
Great. See you next time.